So now we turn to prenatal development. And some people off the bat might ask why in developmental psychology we are talking about this. Shouldn't this be in a biology class? But it turns out that so many of the things that we are going to be dealing with throughout the semester have their bases in this prenatal time. And so it's important to understand how genes, chromosomes, all the like work together to make who we are, at least at this base level. So really, we are interested in how this cell becomes this man. If you don't know Dr. Steve Brule, then check it out. We begin as a single cell weighing about 1/20 millionth of an ounce. That is incredible. 1/20 millionth of an ounce. And so we're going to do a little bit of sex ed because you need to know the terminology. I'm sure some of you will have known all of this before, but you'd be shocked how many people don't. And how can we possibly know if organic foods influence prenatal development if we don't know the terms and how it works? Well, that's why we're doing this. So, reproduction 101. I hope you know this, but sperm, male reproductive cell, ovum, female reproductive cell, together they're called gametes. And, as it says in the slide, an hour after the sperm enters the ovum, the gametes fuse and they create a zygote. So genes are responsible, in large part at least, for who we are, and they are made up of DNA molecules that are along, generally speaking, the vast majority of the time, 46 chromosomes, which are 23 pairs. You get half from your mother, half from your father. And when I say generally 46, there are some cases through spontaneous mutation that you can actually have more or less. We will talk about some of them when we get to gender later in the semester, but also trisomy 21 or Down syndrome is where there are 3 copies of the 21st chromosome, so people with Down syndrome actually have 47 chromosomes. And this is all the information you need to get life going. Of course, you need nutrients, you need a fertile womb, things like that, but it provides at least the building blocks, or maybe rather the blueprint for what is going to happen going forward. So we will start out discussing mitosis and meiosis because it's important to understand how these cells come up. So in mitosis, this is the process in which cells replicate. So you have a cell, and through mitosis, it's going to end up with 2 cells that are identical, barring some kind of mutation, to the original cell. In meiosis, this is where you get sex cells. So instead of 1 cell with 46 chromosomes, you end up with 23 in the cells following, the 4 following. And you can see that in this chart. That mitosis, each of them, you have a parent cell as just the regular old genetic information. Then there's the prophase, and I hope you guys remember at least some of this from biology classes. They double, then there is some semblance of splitting up in these variety of ways. Now, you don't need to know each of these terms, but just be aware that that's kind of what we are dealing with here. So when you are growing a lot, you are going through mitosis, and the way that you make sex cells is through meiosis. So we now have our sex cells at the basic level. So they are going through, in the reproductive process, a sperm hits an egg, and now you are going to be pregnant, at least by some people's definitions. So let's talk about a couple special circumstances. So multiple births. How do you get multiple births? Well, as you see on the slide, less than 3% of all births are twins, and we'll talk a little bit more about why the percentage is actually going up slightly over time. And there are 2 types of identical twins. I'm sorry, there are 2 types of twins, identical and fraternal. Identical twins occur when you have a sperm and egg, 1 sperm and 1 egg, fuse, then a cluster of those cells split off shortly into the pregnancy. And what occurs here is you have two identical pairs of zygotes. You have just simply one part of an egg, fertilized egg, breaking off. And so the genetic information on them is going to be as close to identical as you can get. Again, this is barring mutation largely. The second type, fraternal, is where there are two different eggs that are fertilized by two separate sperm. So, as a woman typically releases one egg. Well, I mean, I guess that depends on who you are and the situation, but theoretically, one egg is released per cycle, and it will be fertilized by one sperm. But if a female releases multiple eggs, then they could get fertilized by multiple sperm. And what that does is that makes it such that there are now two zygotes that are no more alike than any other siblings. So fraternal twins are basically brothers and sisters, brothers or sisters, who are born at the same time, but are not any more alike than any other brother and sister or brother or sister pair that there are. Fraternal twins are more common. And the chances, like I said earlier, of having multiple births is actually increased in recent years, in large part because of fertility treatments. So one of the ways that fertility treatments can work is by having women simply release more eggs. The drugs that they take simply release more eggs. 1 in 10 couples who use fertility drugs have dizygotic twins, have fraternal twins, compared to 1 in 86 who do not. And this is because simply it's odds. The more eggs that are released, the more likely they are to be fertilized, the more likely you are to have multiples fertilized, the more likely you are to have multiple births. This is not surprising at all. And drugs, along with the increasing age of mothers, has dramatically increased the chances of having 3 or more births. This has actually increased. The last statistic I saw, I think it's in your book, is from 1980 to 2000, there was a 4 times increase in twins. Now, this is ostensibly random. There doesn't seem to be a reason why this occurs other than simply being random or drugs that are being taken. However, it's interesting that there are racial differences. The 1 in 70 black pregnancies result in twins, whereas it's 1 in 86 in white twins. So it's odd that there is this difference, especially if it is supposed to be random. And one thing I should say before moving on is that some people say, oh, well, you say it's random to have twins, but twins run in my family. And my response to that would be, maybe they do, but maybe they don't. And the reason I say maybe they don't is when we say that there's a trend or something runs in a family, people generally are talking about 1 or 2, 3 or 4 circumstances where it has occurred in 1 or 2 generations, maybe 3 or 4 generations, cousins, whatever. Well, it could be that just randomly it occurs that way. So theoretically, there's something called a Poisson distribution. And what that what it means is that anytime you have an event, the next time that event is most likely to occur is the next time it can occur. So if your parent, let's say your mother was a twin, the next generation it is most likely to have twins in is actually your generation, the next generation. And that is because if you're taking odds, and this might get a little too mathy for some people, but follow with me if you can, you have to take the chances of having twins in the first generation. And then that's the chances of having twins if it's random. If it's equal for the next generation, well then the second generation, the odds of you having twins is actually the odds of having twins in the first generation times the odds of not having twins in the next generation. because in order for in this case, the third generation to have twins, but the second not to have twins, you have to have both of those things occur. So really, it doesn't seem to me that there's any sense that there actually is twins running in a family. I could be wrong, but if we assume that this is random, randomness is weird. I believe that iTunes actually had to, some years ago, had to change how its random song playing feature worked in iTunes because it was too random. In a truly random scenario, if you have 1,000 songs, you could get 3 Beatles songs back to back to back. But some people don't think that that's random, when in fact it really is random. It's so random people don't understand that that's possible. So they had to tweak it a little bit so it actually appears random when it's not random. But nonetheless, if you didn't follow that, no big deal. Not going to be on test, but it's for those of you who are concerned about it. Okay, so to this point in time, we have how the cells split. You get a fertilized egg. Then we have the understanding of mitosis, meiosis. We have understanding of multiple births, and this is assuming things are going well so far. But let's talk about things, a couple problems, if we can. So the first problem we're going to talk about is infertility. Getting pregnant can be both surprisingly easy and surprisingly hard. So it can be surprisingly easy in that you guys have probably heard of people who the first time they ever had sex, they got pregnant. Or they had several accidents, quote unquote, while they were married, and that's how they ended up with their kids. It can be easy for some people. It can be really hard for other people. And that is in part because you have to have both people be fertile and ready to go at any given time. About 15% of people suffer from infertility, and that is the inability to conceive after 12 to 18 months of trying. So if you go 6 months and you're unable to have a child, that's not infertility. If you go 12 months, it might be. 18 is really where they say it is. Now, they also, if you are told by someone, well, 18 months, that means you're infertile, it doesn't actually mean that you are definitely not ever going to have kids. You all have probably also heard of people who have been told that they were infertile, but they ended up having a child. And unless they go in and actually see what is physiologically going on in your body and they're sure, yes, there is an error in your uterus or something, then you might still be able to have kids. It just could take a while. There is an error in your text. In my text, it's page 69, and newer versions might have corrected it, so double check on this. But on page 69 in my copy, it says that infertility is negatively correlated with age. That's actually not true. Infertility is positively correlated with age, meaning that as you get older, the more infertile you are. Fertility would be negatively correlated with age, but infertility is not. It can happen in men when there's too few sperm that are produced. And this can happen from drug use, cigarettes, STDs. But the system for men to be able to have children is fairly, relatively, I should say, straightforward. In women, it's much more complicated. There's much more going on there. So for women, it can happen due to the failure to release an egg during ovulation. It can happen because of hormone imbalance. It can happen because of alcohol and drug use, STDs, similar to how men happen. It can happen due to stress, but also damaged fallopian tubes or damaged uterus. There's many, many things that can go wrong along the way, and that's why it can be harder to find out why a woman is infertile than a man. You can simply do a sperm count with men. With women, there are many other places it can go wrong. There are lots of different kinds of treatments. There are drugs. There's surgery that can occur, but a couple newer ones let's talk about. The first one is artificial insemination. And this is where sperm are placed directly into the vagina by a physician. This tends to be used when everything is okay with the woman, but the man is infertile. Maybe they kind of make sure that the sperm for the men get to the right place. So that's artificial insemination. The second newish way is in vitro fertilization, and that is INVITRO fertilization. This is where an egg is removed from an ovary and a sperm fertilizes that egg in a lab. Then the fertilized egg is implanted into the uterus. This is effective about a third of the time. And while it is a wonderful procedure that has allowed many, many women to become pregnant when they otherwise might not have been able to, there are some controversies that have been popping up about it. And the primary one that I'm thinking of is the fact that there are potentially millions of fertilized eggs that are being kept in storage facilities because what these medical providers will do is they'll take a bunch of different eggs from a woman. They don't just go in and take one egg. They take several eggs. They try to fertilize multiple ones of them in the lab, and then they get a fertilized egg and they put it in the uterus. Well, that leaves all the other eggs, sperm, that might have even ended up becoming fertilized. So you can have these just thousands and thousands and thousands of situations in which, according to some people, this would be a life, right? If you believe that life is when sperm meets egg, then there are tens, hundreds of thousands of these in cold storage in labs. And it turns out that many people, you generally speaking, keep the rights to your biological property, even if it is under the care of some people. And it turns out that it takes a lot of effort to keep these in storage, and so you have to pay for them to be stored. And this means you have to pay for it, and some people stop paying for it. Well, what does the company who is storing them do? Do they destroy them? If they do, then people could be very upset about that. Families also oftentimes don't want them destroyed because there's this moral conflict, but at the same time they don't want them used. They oftentimes don't want them donated to people. So what do we do with this leftover material? Especially if people just kind of wash their hands of it and say, I don't have it anymore, you guys take care of it. Many labs, like I said, won't destroy them for the ethical problems that come up. So this is something that not a lot of people know about, not a lot of people think about, but is a growing issue. Then the last one of these infertility treatments we're going to talk about briefly is the surrogate mothers. Surrogate mothers is where you simply have someone carry the child for you. And the child, there's many different ways it can occur. It could be IVF. It could be that the woman herself, the surrogate mother, gets pregnant with her own. It could be, who knows how this happens. There's many different ways. In 2011, there were 1,593 babies to gestational surrogates alone. And that's out of 3,953,593 children born that year, which, by the way, is a palindrome, 3953593. Anyway, that is 0.0409% of all children, so less than half of 1% of all children. Now that is up from 1,353 in 2009 and 738 in 2004. So it's doubled from 2004 to 2011. So this typically occurs when there is a woman who is wealthy and can afford to pay a surrogate for this. Generally speaking, surrogates get paid all medical expenses plus fees on top of that. So it's not something that a lot of poor people can afford to do. In terms of miscarriage, miscarriage is a difficult thing to deal with because there are so many different times that miscarriage can occur, ways that it can occur. It's also sometimes referred to as a spontaneous abortion. Generally speaking, what happens is the embryo detaches from the wall of the uterus, and it's simply expelled. Now, this is very different than a common conception of what miscarriage is, which is where you have, a pregnancy going into its third or fourth month, and then the child dies. So that's why the term miscarriage is so hard to understand. And depending on who you talk about, people who believe that that birth begins at conception, you can have a fertilized egg traveling down the fallopian tube that simply does not attach at all to the uterine wall. So if you believe life begins then, that is going to be expelled, and there is no even beginning of an embryo. So this happens relatively frequently. Alternatively, as I said before, an embryo that is attached to the uterine wall can become detached and then expelled. There are estimates that 2/3 to 3/4 of miscarriages happen in the first trimester. And the NIH says that about half of all fertilized eggs are lost spontaneously even before a woman knows she's pregnant, that's a lot. Now, why this occurs is somewhat of a question. It can happen because of a genetic abnormality. If there is some kind of extreme mutation or issue in the meiosis process, and the fertilized egg simply cannot attach to the uterine wall, that could happen. If it attaches, but then things aren't going well, it doesn't develop, and the placenta doesn't develop, the umbilical cord doesn't develop, the whole connection is not made properly, that can occur, and you can expel the fertilized egg or embryo depending on the stage. So there's a lot of reasons why this can occur, but simply saying that someone had a miscarriage, depending on what time in the pregnancy you're talking about, and then also depending on where you believe life begins. Is life at conception when sperm meets egg? Does life begin when an embryo attaches, or when a fertilized egg hits a wall? It really depends, and therefore the term miscarriage can mean different things to different people. An additional problem that can pop up, teratogens. Teratogens are environmental agents that can cause birth defects, and these include drugs, chemicals, viruses, etc. This is a page from your book. I took a picture of it. I couldn't find one that was particularly good, so please excuse the resolution and issues there, but you get the point. You can find it in your textbook. And what it shows is when different parts of the body are particularly susceptible to teratogens. So we can see that the central nervous system has the greatest sensitivity to teratogens in this time period here, from week 3 to a little bit after week 5 in embryonic development. The heart, this is the largest period of time, arm, eyes, legs, etc. So that if you are exposed to a teratogen at, let's say, week 3, so in this time frame, the teeth, palate, external genitalia are not going to, in all likelihood, assuming it is a one-time shot for this teratogen coming in, are not going to be influenced, whereas the central nervous system and heart can. Now, this is obviously not good. In a way, it is good that not everything is always sensitive, but the most important parts, the central nervous system and the heart, are sensitive for long periods of time, especially early on. And this is also why all of this early time is the really, really critical period. That's why when you get up to 36 weeks, 25 weeks even, you can be born and not have that many problems, which is easy for me to say, I know, but I mean relative to having birth at 5 weeks, I mean you're not going to have birth then. The child will die. At least there's a shot up here. Okay, mother's health and diet. In terms of diet, this is not going to surprise you at all. The appropriate weight, nutrition, exercise, all can help mothers during pregnancy. It can reduce the lifetime risk of obesity in their children if they are maintain healthy lifestyles at the time of pregnancy. And a varied diet helps women have fewer complications during pregnancy, have easier labor, and generally everything is just healthier. This is generally a problem in places where there's less to eat, which makes sense, and where good nutrition is difficult to get. If you are wealthy and you have a Whole Foods or a good Publix by you, then it's easy to get good nutrition. But if you are poor and live in a place where there is not that and fast food is the only thing you can do, it is a problem. Which is partially why not all children, I mean, even in prenatal stages, they don't start off on an equal footing. There are dietary supplements that can help. DHA and other prenatal vitamins are suggested. Look into what is in them, though. So DHA that comes from certain sources can be better than in other sources, but nonetheless, that's more detail than we need to get into. STDs and other sexually transmitted diseases can also be directly transmitted to the fetus, so there's issues there as well. In terms of mother's age, mothers greater than age 30 have a greater risk of pregnancy complications. 35 and older is generally the time where they're high-risk pregnancies, but might even want to just call them higher-risk pregnancies. And through this time, there seems to be a decline in egg quality, is how your book puts it. And your book also says that by age 42, 90% of eggs are no longer, quote, normal, end quote. Now, what this means is, this is part of the reason why complications and other issues, Down syndrome is more likely in older women than younger women. But there's this kind of nice, almost normal curve where it seems that as you get older, it's not quite as good to have a pregnancy. Although many people have been born to older women and had no problems. My mother was 36 when she had me and 39 with my sister, and we're doing okay. Conversely, my daughter was born when my wife was 33 and she has Down syndrome. So it's not a one-to-one thing. I mean, mothers who are 17 can have children with Down syndrome. We've met them. Young mothers can have problems too. Adolescent pregnancies have actually reached the lowest level in like 30 years, which is a good thing. But they are more likely to have premature babies. Young adolescent mothers don't seem to have the fully matured reproductive system. And also, the mortality rates are double those of mothers in their 20s. So it seems like the kind of prime time to have children is 20 to 30, at least in terms of what your body is ready for. This is not to say that you are ready or that people should rush to have children in their 20s if they're not ready for it, but just in terms of the body's capability. Prenatal support, big. Age, race, and other issues are comorbid. Basically, what we're talking about here is SES. I have to confess, I'm an SES person. I'm less concerned with race than SES, especially when it comes to these medical conditions. I don't think that race is as big of an issue. If you have money, you can afford better health care. It's not saying that there's no racial issues involved, but poorer people are worse off medically than rich people. Nonetheless, many, especially in teen mothers, many don't have the monetary or social support to help them get through pregnancy. And there's added stress and stigma that comes for these adolescent mothers. And once the child is born, things get harder even more so. So if an adolescent gets pregnant, support might be a problem that actually was what led to them getting pregnant in the first place. If they are having issues and we're going to talk about this when we get to parenting. Life history theory comes into play. But if you have issues with social support, socioeconomic status, we know that people in those conditions are more likely to get pregnant in the first place. So it can be that it's not so much that pregnancy leads to these issues, but these issues cause the pregnancy, and then it becomes this cycle. Drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. We think that hard drugs are problematic, and that's true, but even over-the-counter drugs can cause problems. Aspirin can cause fetal bleeding. There can be growth impairments. Not all the time, depending on your condition. You might actually be. My wife was prescribed a baby aspirin for a medical reason. But other drugs can cause things. Thalidomide is the most famous example. This was given to mothers to help them with morning sickness, and it really did help them. But children who are born to these mothers oftentimes are born without hands and feet. So even when drugs do what they're supposed to do, there can be the consequences. Think of BPA, like we talked about earlier in the semester. There are other issues with drugs that have been linked to cancer or other issues. Taking birth control can be problematic when pregnant. Illicit drugs obviously are a problem, but especially impure ones, it turns out. Not that anyone should do drugs, but supposedly you want like a Breaking Bad type quality drug if you are going to be taking one, but don't take drugs. Okay, alcohol. Even small amounts can affect the fetus. The fetal alcohol syndrome occurs in 1 in 750 people. This is where children are born with below average intelligence, delayed mental and physical growth, a variety of issues there. Now, it is also true that women before, not that long ago, would drink during pregnancy because they didn't know it was a bad thing, and most of the time people did all right. So is it true that just because you have a drink of alcohol in pregnancy, your child is going to have fetal alcohol syndrome? No. Many women, remember, are pregnant without knowing it and ostensibly go on their life and have a glass of red wine or even get pretty drunk a couple times. It's not a good thing. I'm not saying that, but it's also not the kind of thing where if you find out you got accidentally pregnant and you had a drink or two while you were accidentally pregnant and didn't know about it, it's probably not going to be a big deal. Fetal alcohol syndrome is, generally speaking, occurring in people who are heavy, heavy drinkers. But the question is, do you want to risk it? And most people say no. Smoking reduces oxygen, miscarriage is more likely, and your book, at least I believe, is where I got this. It says that smoking leads to more than 100,000 miscarriages and 5,600 deaths in children in the United States per year. In terms of research on fathers, we don't know much about fathers' contributions to many of these things. Primarily, we look at people as individuals. We don't do a very good job of taking Vygotsky's wise wisdom into account here, but nonetheless, we do know that secondhand smoke is bad. Illegal drug usage can have effects chromosomally, but I think the thing that is universally accepted is that stress on mothers is a very bad thing. That fathers can do good and they can also do bad, so especially abuse. It seems that the father's main job, and this is what I took as my job when my wife was pregnant, is not screwing things up. There are some tests that can be done, and you've probably heard of these before. Genetic counselors are emphasized in your book, but it's not just through them, and genetic counselors are something that I suppose some people go to, but it's not something, that's something you'd go to generally if you are having either a series of miscarriages or having issues getting pregnant in the first place. Nonetheless, let's talk about these tests. So, ultrasound. Many of you have seen ultrasounds before. The earliest they'll do ultrasounds is the 11th to 13th week. And ultrasounds are just high frequency sound waves that get shot through the stomach. And the problem with them is they're not very accurate. They can at times identify some types of defects, especially to the trained eye, but it's not quite as good. And the FDA actually has recently been saying try to stay away from extra ultrasounds. It's just one of those things where we're not 100% sure, but it seems like something that if you don't need it, don't do it as much. And you generally will have one, you'll at least have one during pregnancy, but 1, 2, 3, not uncommon. The second test, chorionic villus sampling, or simply CVS if you want to, this is done the 10th to the 13th week. And this is where blood tests are used. And this is generally if there's either a family history of something or if there is a potential problem that shows up in the ultrasound. And in this, a thin needle is placed into the placenta to take a sample of cells of material surrounding the embryo. Now, unlike ultrasound, which has, to our knowledge, no risk of miscarriage, CVS carries with it a 1 in 100 to 1 in 200 chance of miscarriage. You are, after all, placing a needle into the placenta. So this is used sparingly. It's used only if there is thought to be some kind of issue that you want to check out. And I should also say that ultrasound is used the 11th to 13th week primarily because the child before then is too small for you to really see anything. Even when it is the ultrasound is in the 11th to 13th week, it's not very good it's not very good resolution, and so later on it is better to do it. And then finally, amniocentesis. It is 15 to 20 weeks. This is where a small sample of cells is drawn by a needle that is put around the amniotic fluid. And with this test, you can get basically 100% accuracy. There can be, you can detect genetic defects with like 100% accuracy here, and you can also detect sex. Now, in this case, miscarriage is 1 in 200 to 1 in 400. So it's about double, I'm sorry, about half the chance of miscarriage as CVS. There are also some other new blood tests that have been made to detect things like Down syndrome and other genetic abnormalities. It turns out that there are parts of the DNA from the fetus in the mother's blood, so it can be difficult to find them, at least historically. Now they're getting better and better, so that can be used as well as a screen to see if you need to do an amnio or anything like that. Those tests won't tell you if you are 100% sure to have something. They would instead use it, like I said, as a screening. Then you would do an amnio or something to make sure. But oftentimes these tests also are only going to be used if you are going to do anything about it, meaning if you're going to have an abortion. My wife and I actually remember when, during our first pregnancy, the OB asked us if we wanted to do any of the prenatal tests, and we asked just to be sure from her perspective there was no benefit unless we were going to abort, and she said yes, and so we didn't get it done. And it did turn out our oldest has Down syndrome. We wouldn't have aborted anyway, but that's a personal choice. Okay, now that we are through that, let's get to the real the real baby making part here. So there are 3 stages of prenatal development. The first one, germinal stage, which is from the fertilization of the egg to 2 weeks, then the embryonic, and then the fetal. And I don't oftentimes give away test questions, but one question that I always ask people is, when should abortion be legal based on the milestones of prenatal development? Not based on religion or anything like that, which is okay to believe that, but for the purposes of this class, it's a thought exercise for you to think about when we should and should not allow abortion, ostensibly because you think that the little thing is enough of a person to be considered a person. And also, in case, especially for the male viewers here, in case you don't know, although you, again, would be shocked how many women don't know this, but there's an ovary, and it releases an egg, and it goes down and down and down, and fertilization can take place basically anywhere in here, but it can get fertilized on the way down the fallopian tube, and then gets implanted into the uterus. This is also where it can just be discarded straight and away. Now, there are some problems that can occur. An ectopic pregnancy occurs when the fertilized egg implants into the fallopian tube, and that is potentially fatal. This is one of the cases where abortion in the case of the life of a mother can occur, because in that case, it's going to be the mother and child will die. But generally speaking, travels down, 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 implanted in the uterus. So the first stage is the germinal stage, again from fertilization to 2 weeks, and this is where the fertilized egg travels to the uterus. It is the shortest stage, and I have on here the blastocyst. The fertilized egg's name changes, but you don't really need to know that, but it's just if you're looking up things or in your book, you'll see that from time to time. And implantation is the key here. The uterus is rich in nutrients. It is made for this purpose, largely. And it allows for quick cell growth. At 3 days, there's 32 cells, and then it doubles and doubles the next days. And within a week, there's 100 to 150 cells. And in terms of specialization that I put on the slide, some cells start to gain a protective outer layer. Even this early on, and the others will begin forming the placenta and umbilical cord. So, germinal stage. The embryonic stage is 2 to 8 weeks, and the key here, the beginning of this, is when the fertilized egg is securely attached to the wall of the mother's uterus. When this occurs, you have an embryo. We use the weeks as estimates. It can be earlier, it could be a little later. It depends. But the beginning of this is when the fertilized egg is securely attached to the mother's uterus. And there are 3 distinct layers that start to begin. The first one is the outer layer, which is the ectoderm, ECTODERM. And this is going to be skin, hair, teeth, sense organs, and the brain and spinal cord. There is an inner layer, the second is the inner layer, which is the endoderm, ENDODERM, endoderm. And that's kind of the guts and stuff. That's the digestive system, liver, pancreas, respiratory system. And then finally, there's the middle layer, which is called the mesoderm, MESODERM. And this is muscles, bones, blood, circulatory system. And at the end of the 8th week, the fetus will be 1 inch long and it'll look like it has gills and a tail. It's going to look more fish or amphibian-like than it is going to look like a human. But you will see the beginnings of the eyes, nose, lips, teeth, things like that. The head also, as you can see in the picture on the slide, is disproportionately long. It's about 50% of length, and it gets shorter and shorter, and actually even the head at birth and until you are 12 or so, the head is disproportionately large compared to the rest of the body. Neurons are growing all the time here, as many as 100,000 per minute. That's amazing. 100,000 neurons per minute at times. And around the 4th or the 5th week, the brain begins to, quote, work, unquote. But this really depends on your definition. So if the brain is working simply by getting a little bit of an electrical pulse, then yes, it's working. But if you think that you have to be able to have some kind of thoughts or brain structures or anything, then clearly the brain has not begun. There are things kind of firing early on, but does that really mean that the brain is working? It's questionable here. And around this time, also, the rest of the nervous system begins to function, and at around 6 weeks, there's a heartbeat. Now, the fetal stage starts at 8 weeks, and this officially occurs when there is a differentiation of organs. At this point in time, the fetus can now swallow and urinate. They have arms, legs, fingernails. There's brain hemispheres growing. Myelination is occurring. We'll talk about more throughout the semester. And at 8 weeks, its head is half its length. By 4 months, it's about a quarter of its length. So it's still getting smaller and smaller relative to the rest of the body. And weight increases quickly. So by 4 months, it's about 4 ounces. 7 months, it's about 3 pounds. And on average birth, around 7 or so pounds. About 4 months in, the mother can feel the child kick and move. But at first, now obviously I've never had this occur for me physically, but taking it from other people's accounts, at first you're probably not going to know if it was a kick for sure or not. You might wonder, is it a kick or was it gas or something else going on? Because believe it or not, there's a lot going on in a woman's body when this is occurring. You'll also see in the last 2 slides, I've had these charts. One of the fun things to keep track of is about how big your child is. Now, the size of these, the vegetable they are, size-wise, is not precise, and sometimes it'll seem odd. So, is a leek really smaller than a honeydew, or larger than a honeydew melon? I don't know. Pineapples are more elongated than coconuts and cantaloupes. So, but nonetheless, it's fun. Look it up. So now let's talk about some potential controversies, and this is more questions for you, as opposed to me telling you anything about anything. There are new technologies that people are trying to come up with where designer babies are available, where you could pick the eye color of your child, pick the sex. Would you want to do that? Do you have an idea of who your child should be in your mind? But then also questions about what kind of screenings you should do. Ultrasound, there's no chance of a miscarriage. CVS, it's 1 in 100 to 1 in 200. Amnio, 1 in 200 to 1 in 400. And then there are some diseases that you might be able to find out about, especially going forward. Huntington's is a disease that doesn't appear until your 40s. Then there's delusions, dementia, loss of memory, a ton of bad stuff. It is fatal. So you might have kids when you are 30 and start to develop Huntington's around 40. And it is something that you could find out about. Would you want to know that? Would you change how you live? Very, very heavy questions. But then the abortion question I want to get back to. Abortion is a big controversy, one of the biggest social issues that we have. Now, some estimates are that about a quarter of abortions take place for women over 30, 33% women 20 to 24, about 20% girls 15 to 19. So it's relatively evenly split across the lifespan. Now, the estimates will vary about how many abortions occur at which trimester. According to prochoice.org, which I understand could be slightly biased, 88% end in the first trimester. Also, 88% are in metropolitan areas. More than 80% are to unmarried women. So there's several questions that come up here. There's the ethics of it, and then there is the kind of execution of it. So in terms of the ethics, the morals, is it right to do? If so, what time in the lifespan, which is really the main question I have for you to figure out for the purposes of this class. but then also trying to figure out if it should be legal. Well, it currently is in the United States, thanks to several different Supreme Court cases. It's not just Roe v. Wade, although that is the most famous one. Planned Parenthood v. Casey is another big one. But if it is legal and continues to be legal in the United States, what kind of restrictions can we have on it? Should it be done in medical facilities? That's a recent Supreme Court case was dealing with that. So really, just trying to figure out when it should be available, where it should be available, and why. Because I honestly don't care as much about what you believe as long as you have a reason for it, a rationale for it, as long as you have thought about it. If your reason to not have an abortion or not have abortion be legal in the United States, obviously personally it's completely up to you, but if you believe we shouldn't have it, or conversely that we should have it, I'd like that there would be a thought out logic to it. So hopefully this lecture can help give a little bit more insight into what's going on.